Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Being Rusty on Sports. I'm Rusty Harrison. Today I'm going to talk to you about my fandom, the teams that I support in different sports leagues, and have a discussion on where I came from as a fan and how that has impacted on the teams that I've supported over the years. And also, in discussing this, probably also look at the shifts in support where they've occurred. Teams that I've really become interested in that in the past I didn't support, but during a particular era in a sport that I could say that that team became a favorite of mine in that brief period of time. But I think, as most fans can relate, we all have our allegiances based on our hometowns, our home regions, our national teams in different sports. So that has some bearing on my choices as well. So let's see how we do as I go along here. You'll notice that sometimes I look down on the keyboard. I'm not exactly a touch typist. I'm more of a hunt and peck type. So please bear with me when I do that. But let's take a look. So I'll start with the National Hockey League, the NHL. And basically, I'll talk about teams that I've supported over the long term and also focus on some teams that I particularly like to watch, if not support in terms of a rooting interest. But I think it'll be interesting to look at that. Now, to begin with, being from Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada, most of my friends growing up were Toronto Maple Leaf fans. And if you look at how allegiances are in general throughout Canada, Toronto probably has the biggest fan base throughout the country. Now, being from Ontario, of course, growing up, this was before the Ottawa Senators came into existence. So the bulk of people that I associated with, my classmates, my friends, my family, most people had a rooting interest for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So that has some bearing in what I'm going to describe how my allegiances evolved. Because although I supported a number of Toronto Maple Leaf players as a fan, people I rooted for, this is before fantasy hockey was a thing, but these are players that I admired, and I'll note them as we go along here. Um, so just in terms of Toronto, I'm not a fan, but growing up, there were a number of players that I got to see all the time. Uh, Players that were on TV twice, three times a week. So I got to know the club. I watched it on CBC in Toronto, CBLT, I believe it was called. That was the station, as well as CHCH, which was the hometown channel in Hamilton where I grew up. So I got to see the Wednesday night games on CHCH. I got to see the Saturday night games on Hockey Night in Canada. So I was able to follow the Leafs quite a bit. Now, in general, the teams in the 70s, it was a very tough period for the Leafs. This was the era of Harold Ballard, the owner, who became sole owner, I believe it was in the early 70s. And you could cue the circus music because Harold Ballard's reign as owner has been considered by many to be the most infamous ownership period in the history of the league. Particularly if you talk to many Leaf fans of my age. I'm in my mid-50s, so this isn't news to people. So, in the case of Harold Ballard, this affected how the team developed from a coaching perspective, from a scouting perspective, the kind of players that would be interested in playing. You have to understand that Toronto has tremendous advantages for Canadian players, particularly in my day as a young fan, because simply put, Toronto was the big market team that had the most coverage and the most fans across the country. So this had a direct impact on what people's expectations were. So, in part, my fandom was one of liking the individual players, but also having some objection to how the team was being run. And also because I was interested in history, I got to understand the history of Toronto's relationship with Hamilton in terms of Hamilton having a team in the 1920s and then subsequently losing it, which I'll cover in a future video. But the fact is that Hamilton, for many, many years, has tried to get bids for expansion teams, attempted to get relocations of existing teams that are not doing so well. And so these things were in play. And quite often there was a perception among many Hamiltonians, myself included, that Toronto had an active interest in stopping Hamilton from getting an NHL team because of their historical territorial interests. And when I cover the Jim Balsillie NHL case of the Phoenix Coyotes bankruptcy of 2009, I'll go into greater depth about that. But there was a memo that came out in that case that I never knew about until I actually saw it when it was released to the public, in which a lawyer for the Leafs actually argued that Toronto had a territorial veto over the entire region, including Hamilton, of the immediate Golden Horseshoe, the Greater Toronto Area, as it's called. And so that was something that resonated to me, because when I started to learn as a youngster that Hamilton actually had a team, I always had an interest in finding out why Hamilton didn't retain the team, and subsequently why Hamilton never got the team back. So that was an important factor because as someone who was following hockey as as a young person trying to get all the information that I could over time, I did develop a bit of a resentment about how the Leafs were run, not just as someone who was watching the team play, but also in terms of how the history of the team did have an impact on Hamilton getting a team. So let's just say that I'm not a fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I respect the history of the franchise. Many of my friends, many of my family, many people I grew up with are Leaf fans. So I can see the attraction, the historical significance of the franchise in Canada. So I don't have a problem with that whatsoever. But from where I am situated as a fan, I don't root for the Leafs. But I will write down some names because I think it's important to situate where I am in terms of my fandom and people that I have a tremendous respect for. I'm going to start with Daryl Sittler, the center and longtime captain. A player that I think is undervalued by many outside of central Canada, particularly Ontario. Um, Over time, his career is not as celebrated as it was when I was, of course, growing up. But over time, it's just there's less talk about Daryl Sittler and how important he was for the franchise during the Ballard era. And I think that it's important to understand how great a player he was. He holds the NHL record with 10 points in one game, 6 goals, and 4 assists in a game in 1976, I believe, against the Boston Bruins. I happened to watch that game on TV. So that was a special moment as a fan. I'd never seen a player score that many points before. Um, Even over 8 points was amazing. This was pre Wayne Gretzky, so it was amazing. And he had also scored 5 goals in a playoff game. That was later, I believe, against the Philadelphia Flyers in one series. He also scored the game-winning goal and series-winning goal in overtime in the Canada Cup final of 1976 against Czechoslovakia, where he beat Vladimir Dzrila, the goalie. I believe it was top corner. Beat him short side to the stick side. So that was a magic moment, and he was capable of delivering in big games. He never won a Stanley Cup, but I always admired him. He was also one of the toughest superstars I've ever seen play, just in terms of his ability to fight. He was absolutely one of the more vicious fighters I've ever seen, pound for pound. You did not want to get him angry. In many ways, he was like Bobby Orr in that respect. Bobby Orr didn't have to fight, obviously. He played on the big bad Bruins of the 1960s and 70s. But like Sittler, Orr was also one of those types of guys that he could drop the gloves and go with anyone. I'm not a big fighting fan. I would just want to make that clear, but I think it's important to note that in that era, Sittler and Orr were both players that could handle themselves very well in rough situations. Another player that I loved for the Leafs, and again, he's one of those players that you think of trailblazers, really big pioneers in the history of hockey, and that would be Börje Salming, coming over in the 1970s from Sweden. He was the first main European defenseman from Sweden, from Europe, to become a superstar in the NHL. I would argue that he's in my top 5 of all time in terms of head manning the puck, the first pass getting out of the zone, a player that played on really bad teams quite often with Toronto. But he's in the Hall of Fame, and he's in the Hall of Fame not just for his talent, but I think in recognition, like Sittler, someone who never won the Stanley Cup, but someone who was admired by his peers, someone who showed that Europeans belonged in the NHL at a time where the World Hockey Association was really becoming the destination for European players. So this is an important milestone in terms of my fandom, was to being exposed to European players for the first time. And Börje Salming was a huge part of that. Another player for them that I think I would stress is important for me is Mike Palmateer. Mike Palmateer had a relatively short career as a major goaltender in the league. He had a few peak years in the late 70s. As he got older, he developed a chronic knee problem, which shortened his effectiveness as a goaltender. But he was one of those guys that you just couldn't take your eyes off of when he was on. He was a hot and cold goaltender, but he was one of those guys that, he was very flamboyant, made big kick saves, dove all over the place. He was also a left-handed goalie, which was kind of unique. I think probably the most famous left-handed goalie in my young fandom that people could relate to or think about would be Grant Fuhr of the Edmonton Oilers, but Mike Palmateer predated him. And so Mike Palmateer was one of those guys that backstopped the Leafs in the late 70s to deep playoff runs. And he was a clutch goalie. But he played on a team that unfortunately could not stack up to the Montreal dynasty. And it's one of those great what ifs. If the team had been allowed to stay together, and we can go into that in a future video, just how the Leafs were dismantled under Ballard and Punch Imlach, his general manager in the late 1970s. That core of players, and those three in particular, did make watching the Toronto Maple Leafs an important part of my upbringing as a hockey fan, simply because they were the team in my market growing up that I was able to watch on a weekly basis. So that was important. But I will say this. The team that I loved and still love today, Montreal Canadiens. Their 1970 dynasty, just an incredible collection of players. 14 Hall of Famers: Guy Fleur, Steve Shutt, Larry Robinson, Jacques Lemaire, a core of players that were fantastic to watch. Steve Shutt, I don't believe, is in the Hall of Fame, but he's someone that certainly would be deserving, in my opinion. But Lafleur really was the flagship of that franchise as a player. His recent passing touched me. Um, as a hockey fan, as a fan of all sports, I think when we lose someone who we looked up to as kids, um, it hits you particularly hard. You know, you appreciate the fact that, you know, as you get older, some of the great players, some of the main figures that you support as a fan, you know, they pass. And he recently lost his battle with cancer. But again, the Montreal Canadiens of that era were the greatest hockey team I've ever seen. And I've seen a number of great dynasties in my time. But I still believe that the Montreal Canadiens of the 1970s were the best team over their 4-year run as Stanley Cup champions, but also through the entire decade of the 1970s, under Scotty Bowman as coach. So I think it's important to understand that I love the Canadiens, but I had a problem because I usually had to wait until April to really see them on an extended basis. I was able to watch some games on Radio Canada, the CBC French network here in Canada. So I was able to catch some games of the Canadiens during the regular season, but quite often I would only catch the Canadiens if they were playing Toronto, or Toronto was on the road on a Saturday, things like that. So, you know, I got to watch them during the playoffs because quite often Toronto would get eliminated before Montreal. Sometimes Toronto didn't even make the playoffs. So I was able to catch the Canadiens on that basis. So, you know, I developed a love for the Canadiens that continued during the 1980s with Patrick Waugh, with the rise of Guy Carbonneau as one of the great two-way centers in the league, two-way forwards. Just like Bob Gainey, Guy Carbonneau, multiple time Selke Trophy winner as best defensive defenseman, or best defensive forward, I should say. You had a great deal of character on those teams. Larry Robinson, a stalwart of both the 1970 dynasty and also the 1986 Cup. So, you know, the last Stanley Cup for the Montreal Canadiens was 1993, but I'm still a fan. I still am one of those people that hope that I'll see another Canadiens Cup victory. Unfortunately, of course, it's been close to 30 years now. So hopefully that will change. They were in the Stanley Cup Finals 2 years ago. So they had a bad year last year, of course. They drafted first in the recent draft. But they definitely have a history and a tradition that I admire quite a bit as a fan. Another team that I support, Detroit Red Wings. Less so in the 1970s because they were just garbage, to be blunt. They were even worse than the Maple Leafs during the early 70s. And really until the rise of Steve Yzerman in the 1980s, the Red Wings were a terrible franchise. But I got into the Oilers as a fan, watching them rise and win Stanley Cups. And one of their main competitors, apart from, of course, Calgary in their division, in the Smythe division, was the Detroit Red Wings in the late 1980s. You had Yzerman, you had Bob Probert, you had, I believe it was Tim Chevelday was the goalie in the early 90s. There were a number of players that I really liked. Joey Kosher, tough as nails. It was a fun team to watch, and it took them a long time to get to the mountain, to the top of the mountain, which they did in 1997 when they won their first Stanley Cup in 42 years. And Steve Yzerman was finally able to raise a Stanley Cup. So I have an affinity for the Red Wings. I would say that over recent years, they became my favorite NHL team, but the Canadiens and the Red Wings are neck and neck for me. Also, the Buffalo Sabres. Again, growing up in Hamilton, I had the opportunity to follow a lot of Buffalo media, TV, radio. So I got to follow the Sabres. Ted Darling, Rick Jeanneret. Ted Darling was the broadcaster for TV. Rick Jeanneret was the Buffalo radio broadcaster for many, many years. He just recently retired. So Buffalo has a soft spot for me. Gilles Perreault was one of my favorite players growing up. He was a dominant center, one of the most graceful players to ever play. And those three teams, Montreal, Detroit, and Buffalo, they really are my favorites in the NHL. So, recent years, I haven't had much success in terms of rooting for a champion. 2008 was the 2007 season was the last time the Detroit Red Wings won the Stanley Cup. So that's the last of those three teams to win the Cup. Sabres have never won the Stanley Cup, and Montreal hasn't won since 1993. So, as you'll see, it's a pattern for me because a lot of the teams that I support in different leagues haven't won. So I'm not one to jump on a bandwagon. I might like to watch particular teams and particular players over time because they were fun to watch in the period that we're talking about. But in terms of teams that I have allegiance for, they haven't had a lot of success. So it's one of those things. But you know, I'm not somebody who is a fair weather fan. So that's one example in the NHL. So let's take a look at the others. So on the next league I'll look at is the Canadian Football League. And this is an easy one for me. Again, being from Hamilton, I am a Hamilton Tiger-Cat fan. If you've caught the first two episodes of the Michael and Rusty show, the podcast I do with my nephew, Michael Willoughby, we talk about the Ticats a lot because we're both fans. I can vaguely remember sitting with my dad when I was 5 years old, watching the Hamilton Ticats. So I started early. There's a saying that one hears in Hamilton that you learn mama, dada, and oski wee wee. Those are the first three expressions that you learn as a child. So I became a Tirecat fan very young. And Hamilton had a very proud history. In the 1950s and 1960s, they were the dominant franchise in terms of success. Multiple Grey Cup wins. They quite often lost the Grey Cup too, particularly to Winnipeg in those days. They got to the Grey Cup a lot. But growing up, starting to follow the game in the 1970s, there were some bright spots, but in general, it was not a good time to be a Hamilton Tirecat fan. And the only thing as a Tirecat fan that was really any good and could be counted on was that the Toronto Argonauts were going to perform even worse. But that's a whole different discussion in terms of the rivalry. I respect the Argonauts. I just don't have to like them as a fan. I can make that distinction as I've gotten older. I can separate and recognize when the Argonauts have been great, and they have been, particularly in the Doug Flutie era. Pinball Clemens is one of my favorite players ever. But as a Hamilton fan, I do have to say I have to remain consistent in terms of my allegiances. But being a Hamilton fan, there is an association with a love of defensive football. Harold Ballard, of course, was also the owner of the Hamilton Ticats during the late 70s and into the 80s. And for me in particular, the year that I always remember is 1986 when the Ticats won the Grey Cup in Vancouver. Ben Zambiazzi was my favorite player. Before that, in the 1970s, Jimmy Edwards, the running back. And even before him, Garney Hanley. Although Garney Hanley was late in his career, those three players were really, really big for me, as well as Tom Clements, the quarterback who played for Hamilton during the early 1980s. These were my main players as a fan. So I went to many games at Everwin Stadium. Sometimes it was called I Never Win Stadium. But Hamilton Ticats have a very deep place in my heart. And it's been a long time since they've won. They haven't won the Grey Cup since 1999. So that's a long time too. But again, sometimes you're just born into situations, and in my case, my allegiance to Hamilton, as a young kid, it's still there today. I like the Alouettes as well. I'm based in Montreal now, so I do follow that team, and I do support them in any game that doesn't involve Hamilton. But those are the teams that I follow in the CFL. So I'll write that down as well. The Montreal Alouettes, they would be my second team in Canada. Moving on to the NFL, National Football League. So when I was younger, the main teams of the 1970s were the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Oakland Raiders. Dallas Cowboys were the dominant team in the National Football Conference. The Raiders and the Steelers were the dominant teams in the AFC. I don't like the Steelers, which for some people is odd when you tell them you're from Hamilton, because people do associate Pittsburgh with Hamilton. They're two steel cities. They both wear black and gold. Many Tirecat fans are Steeler fans. My sister is a big Pittsburgh fan, but I was a Raider fan. I loved the silver and black uniform. Just the way Ken Stabler played his quarterback, the dynamic play of Cliff Branch as a wide receiver, as a game breaking wide receiver. Fred Biletnikoff, uh, Dave Casper, great players, great receivers. Ted Hendricks is my favorite linebacker of that era. The whole team just captivated me. So I would say that the Oakland, and I'll just include this because they've moved quite a bit, Los Angeles and now Las Vegas Raiders. The Raiders have not won a Super Bowl since 1983. So that's, again, a long drought. But again, growing up as a young football fan, Raiders were one of the great teams. They won 3 Super Bowls. John Madden was their coach. Al Davis was the owner. So, I began to follow them. And it was kind of odd because they're a West Coast team, and I didn't get to see a lot of their games, being someone in Eastern Canada. But I became a fan of the Raiders, and have been for a long, long time. So if they're 1, I do have a 1A. And because I grew up in Hamilton, and it's the same thing with the Buffalo Sabres, I also was exposed to a lot of Buffalo Bill games. Buffalo Bills were not a great team in the 1970s. Their greatest player was O.J. Simpson. And of course, he has become more famous, or infamous, as it were, for his actions off the field. But Buffalo had a very good team in the mid 1970s for a few years there. And they were a contender. But because of bad decision making, lousy coaching, quite frankly, bad injuries that really took away from the team, and the fact that they were in the strongest conference of the two, they had a problem competing to get into the playoffs. Quite often, Miami was very successful in that era as well, winning 2 Super Bowls under Don Shula in 72 and 73. But Miami was always very good. uh, the New England Patriots in the 1970s. They had many good teams. New York Jets were on the decline under Joe Namath as quarterback, but the Bills, because I was able to watch most of their games, particularly road games. I got to follow them. You had Rick Azar on radio. Um, Later, Van Miller, of course, legendary radio announcer for them. I got to follow the Bills quite a bit. They weren't as successful as the Raiders, but definitely in terms of allegiance, I always was a Bills fan. And of course, in the 1990s, you had the Buffalo Bills winning 4 straight AFC championships and going to 4 straight Super Bowls, unfortunately losing them all, each of them, to particularly Dallas in that era. Jim Kelly as the quarterback, Thurman Thomas as the star halfback, a really good defense. You had Bruce Smith, you had Cornelius Bennett. That was a very exciting team. You could argue that that was the best team that never won a Super Bowl. That's an argument. But, I'd also seen Marv Levy as coach of the Montreal Alouettes in the 1970s. And I always admired him as a coach. And when he went to Buffalo, he changed the entire program, and they became winners. Buffalo's had a lot of heartbreak. You could point to them and also look at the Minnesota Vikings in the same way. I kind of have a soft spot for the Vikings as well. Not to the point where I seek them out every week. But if there's a team that I would like to see win a Super Bowl, and it's not, the Raiders or the Bills, I think it would be the Vikings. I do have a soft spot for the underdog quite often. So that's something that's there for many fans, I would believe. So as a fan, it would be the Raiders and the Bills for me. In the NFC, not as much. Um, I follow the NFC like everybody else, because it was particularly the dominant conference in the 1980s. I was an admirer of the San Francisco 49ers and the dynasty they had under Bill Walsh, with Joe Montana as quarterback and Jerry Rice as their star receiver. So, there were great teams in the NFC that I got to see a lot. But I would say that the Raiders and the Bills are the two teams that I have a particular affinity for in the NFL. Now, in terms of basketball, I'm not a big basketball fan. There are players that I really like. I would say Stephen Curry is my favorite player currently. But if there's a team that I do support, it would be the Detroit Pistons. And particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, they were a contender. They won a couple of championships. They were a thorn in the side of the Celtics and of the Bulls. And I admire Michael Jordan. I think he's the greatest player I've ever seen. But as a Pistons fan, you had to deal with Bird, you had to deal with Jordan, and I just loved how the Pistons played basketball. They were a defensive team. They had a rightful reputation as a very tough, physical team. Chuck Daly was a great coach, and so I really got into the Pistons during the Bad Boys era. Isaiah Thomas being the main star, but you had Joe Dumars, Bill Lambier. It was a really solid basketball team, and in recent times they haven't done so well. They haven't won the championship, I believe, since 2003. But they're a team that I do try to keep up on. I'm not a big basketball fan, but I do try to watch the playoffs when I can, because I think that's when the basketball is the best. And so it's a sport that at the highest level I definitely will try to watch, but I just don't watch it as much as I do with football and hockey. Baseball, baseball, definitely Major League Baseball. I played fastball as a kid, so I love baseball. And for me, the team that I followed the most, Montreal Expos. Of course, they eventually moved to Washington. That was a very sad day for me. But the Expos dynasties of I should rephrase that, not dynasties, but the big eras of the Expos. In the late 70s, you had Gary Carter, Andre Dawson, Tim Raines, Steve Rogers, an incredible core of players who you could argue for a 4-year period. They were the best team in baseball. But again, they never won the World Series. But as a Canadian who loved baseball, that era of Montreal Expos baseball, that was coinciding with Toronto, as the Toronto Blue Jays expansion team was developing as an organization in the American League. That was a special situation because Montreal was really at the forefront of baseball in Canada. And it was there was a rival there to the Canadians in terms of fan allegiance and I wouldn't even say dominance, because that's not fair. I think the Canadians, Montreal is a hockey city. But the Expos, if you looked at all the print that was happening in Montreal newspapers in that era, people were mad about the Expos. And so it was sad that the Expos never got past the National League Championship Series. The year that they got there against the Los Angeles Dodgers in 1981. But that was something that captivated not only Montreal, but I would say the entire country, because it was the first time a Canadian team had actually competed to that level and almost made the World Series. So Montreal, it's another franchise that, it's just almost became a champion, but never got there. In 1994, they had the best team in baseball by record. And they were, I would say, a shoo-in for the World Series. But of course, the season ended because of a strike. And so, tragically for Montreal fans, the Expos did not win that year. And that was really the last year where Montreal was a threat for the World Series title. I followed the Blue Jays as well, less so as a partisan, but again, because I was growing up in Ontario, I got to see a lot of Blue Jay games. I watched a lot of Blue Jay games with my father on TV. Also, I went to a number of games, both at Exhibition Stadium and later at the Sky Dome, which is now the Rogers Center. So I got to follow the Blue Jays. And there were great players in that era that I really admired. Dave Stieb, the pitcher, Lloyd Moseby, the center fielder, Jesse Barfield as well. One of the great right fielders of all time in terms of his throwing arm. You had a tremendous reaction to the Blue Jays in Toronto. So I admired Toronto, but I also became a fan of the Detroit Tigers, which was interesting. Um, just because Toronto and Detroit were huge rivals in the American League in the mid to late 80s. So I like the Tigers. Since the Expos since the Expos franchise moved to Washington, I've also supported the Cincinnati Reds. I'm not a Yankees fan at all. I kind of have a soft spot for the Red Sox, and that might be because I support the Red Sox over the Yankees whenever they play. And I love Fenway Park as a stadium. It's just an amazing experience to watch. I've never been at a game, but it's something that's on my bucket list, definitely. I support Detroit probably the most today, and they haven't had great success since the 2010s. But I would say that for baseball, when I think of the team that I just loved and lived and died for as a fan, it would be the Expos. So I have a soft spot for baseball, but it's not as present in my mind as it was growing up because I played baseball. I played a form of baseball called fastball. So that's where that's where I get my love for the game because it was the one sport that I actually played, and I was relatively good as a kid playing baseball. I mainly played outfield. Had a good throwing arm. But again, that's something that it imparts a great deal of wisdom as a fan. Baseball more than any other sport, just because of the sheer length of the season, and understanding that not every game is the end of the world. There is a finality to the playoffs in every sport, but every season is a marathon. Even in a sport like football, which has 17 games in National Football League. It has 18 games in the Canadian Football League season. It still has that feeling of a marathon. So I don't get as locked in on the actual events of a game than others do. I think part of that as well is just the fact that we have so much fantasy baseball, fantasy football, fantasy hockey. People have a very minute focus on the moment, and that has an impact on how they follow the game and how they react to players having success or failure. And so I'm not really in that headspace. So I have more of a long-term view. And being a baseball fan, I think, contributes to that. I think it's affected how I look at things in terms of how teams are put together and future success. So I think I'm more patient than most when it comes to the teams that I support. And that has a bearing, of course, on the fact that I still support teams that aren't all that successful. I don't jump on bandwagons. So that's really where I'm at with that. So in terms of other sports, I love soccer. I particularly like the World Cup. I've always enjoyed the Brazilian national team. Pele was my favorite player growing up. Uh, I love Barcelona today. I don't follow the game religiously, but I always appreciated Lionel Messi when he played with Barcelona. I know he's now at PSG, Paris Saint Germain. So I will follow the big tournaments in soccer, but I'm not in as much detail in terms of following it daily or even weekly as I would be with football and hockey. In that order, football I'm in all the way. So soccer is a big one. Used to love tennis, big time in the 70s. Bjorn Borg, Jimmy Connors, John McEnroe. With the women, there was Chris Everett and Martina Navratilova. Before that, Billie Jean King. So that was something that I watched a lot, particularly Wimbledon. I don't follow it as much now, but at its best, tennis is great. So those are really the sports that I follow, at least the sports that I want to talk about today, because I follow a lot of sports. But I'd like to hear from you if you'd like to leave a comment on your favorite sports and the teams that you support. And I admire all fan bases in general, because I do appreciate loyalty to one's team. But I've also learned that as a fan, over the years, you have to have a respect for other teams, even if they're teams that are rivals of the teams that you support. So my approach over the years, but particularly now, having this podcast and also the one that I share with my nephew Michael, I try to make this as welcoming as possible. I don't judge, and I think that's important. I think we can all respect our choices and admire the players that make it so enjoyable to be a sports fan. The coaches that help influence successful teams. You know, the organizations that are successful. Why are they successful? And you have to have respect for that as a fan. So I'd like to know what your allegiances are. What fandom do you have? And also, in the comments, talk about the kinds of things you'd like me to look at, the subjects that you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Many of my takes are going to be on things that have influenced me in the past as a fan. My approach on this channel is going to be looking at sports history from a fan perspective. Players and teams that I admired, that I watched, that I think are interesting to talk about, because a lot of that history can be lost in the 24/7 mediascape that we have now in sports. So I'd like to know from you what you'd like to hear from me in terms of my fandom, my opinion on things. But understand that I'm approaching this mainly as a fan in terms of sports history, particularly in sports like football, hockey, and baseball, and to get your input on what you would like to see from this podcast. If you enjoyed today's program, please like and subscribe. And as we grow this channel, I hope to entertain you and enlighten you whenever I can. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope we can do this again very soon. Until then, have a good day.